Hi and welcome to this video in the QPSMR Going Deeper series, in which we explore the questions worksheet and work around all the features that you have at your disposal when you use QPSMR. Now there's no example files for this video because we're going to take you around the whole thing here and show you all the features that you've got available, and it's also applicable to QPS Insight and QPS Companion users, so the things will be pretty much the same in each piece of software, although we'll point out where they are in each one. So we're going to start with QPSMR Insight, and we're going to talk about all the features because pretty much all the comments here will be applicable to what we find when we go into QPS Companion a little bit later on. So we're going to start by going to the question worksheet, and the idea of this video is to take you around everything on this screen so that you know how to use it and what the rules are that are applied to each selection that you might make. Now you'll find with some of these options that they become enabled or disabled depending on things that you select on this particular worksheet as we work round. So let's start with first of all the name of the entry that you're entering here, and there are some rules attached to this. The name should be up to 30 characters in length. It should be 29 characters if you happen to be using a grid in the Insight software. I tend to recommend that you avoid using any special characters. So whilst you can have a fair range of lists of names that you can give to your entries, you must avoid things like a colon, an exclamation mark, a hat sign, a backslash, a semicolon, asterisk, an underscore, and that tilde character. But you could have a question called 3/4 or something like that. That would be perfectly acceptable. I would recommend though that you always start your question or entry names with a letter, and the reason for that is if you refer them into variables later on, you don't have to put them inside quotes if you refer to them. So if we called our question here simply 1, we'd have to refer to it inside single quotes if we used it in a variable later on. So it's preferable to actually just call that Q1, and then perhaps any variables you've got, V1, V2, and any filters that you've got, maybe F1, F2, and things like that. So you've got some naming convention that makes it easy to follow. All right, so we're going to start here with a question 1, just to see what we put in here. As I say, you can use up to 30 characters for your question name length. And you'll see as I select the question type over here, different options will appear. Now let's first of all look at the list of different question types that we've got and understand those. So a single code only question means that you're having a list of responses, one or more responses, but respondents can only select a maximum of 1 response. They can't select more than 1. And there's no way of overriding that at data entry or data collection time. So if you wanted to ask someone what their favourite TV programme was, they might choose 2. You'd be advised to make that a multiple coding question if you wanted to allow more than 1 answer. Multiple coding questions are similar to single recoding questions in the sense they have a list of responses. The difference there is that a respondent can choose any number of those. The next 2, weight and integer, are for collecting numeric data. So if you want a whole number, integer without decimal point is the one you want. If you want to be able to select decimal places, you'll need to select weight with decimal point, which you might think of as a real number or some other name. The next one in the list is a character. Now character questions allow you to type in a piece of text as it stands. That's really should be careful how you use that. That's really not for open-ended questions. You'll see verbatim text further down where you have open-ended questions that you might want to code at a later stage. This is really where perhaps you want to type in someone's name or something you don't tend to do much with later on, although there are some tools to analyse character questions. Text for interviewer is just an instruction to the interviewer. We'll be looking at that in a minute. And date and time are typically only used in CATI interviews where you want to set a date and time, perhaps to call someone back. So we won't cover those in this particular video. They'll be covered in the CATI set of videos. All right, so let's select the first one. Now I've selected single here, and you'll notice that sample point and quota have become activated. That's because I'm using QPSMR CATI rather than QPSMR Insight, which means that you can assign a particular question or entry as a sample point or as part of your quota management. So that won't be appearing if you're just using Insight. And then down here, I can start to use different options as we'll work down the screen in a minute. Multiple coding, you'll see that disappears, so there's no option for that there. If I select a weight or an integer, you'll see that I get another field jump up here. You'll see that the width needs to be specified here. So you need to assign the maximum width that needs to be allowed for that integer. And let's say it's a percentage. You would then allow 3 digits because 100% is the most that you could collect. If you didn't know how many digits, you might just set a more generous amount. So if you wanted to ask someone what their income was for the year, that could be quite a high figure. So you would definitely allow enough digits to store the maximum that you thought was possible. Now, if you choose a weight here, you'll see that, again, you've got to set the width. But of course, you've got to allow for decimal places. So if you were selecting a number maybe with 2 decimal places, you will need to allow for the decimal place itself and the 2 characters after the decimal point, plus, of course, any number of characters you're going to allow for the figures before the decimal point. Now, when you choose any of these numeric options, you'll see down here that these 2 options become enabled. If I select single, you'll see they're disabled. If I select integer, you'll see they're enabled. And what these allow you to do is to specify a valid range of answers for numerics. So for a percentage just now, you might want to say that should be between 0 and 100, for example. And that would be a way of saying that my minimum percent is 0 and the maximum is 100, and I would need to set a width of 3 for that, and that will allow me to input that data. Now, the plus at the bottom here can be confusing sometimes. That's not doing any addition. These are additional valid codes that you want to enable. The reason for that is some people sometimes use codes like 999 or 998 to mean other and don't know and things like that. So if somebody said not much and you wanted to code that as 998, that would be a way of entering 998 and allowing that. Without that, it would only let me key in a figure of 0 to 100 and nothing else outside that range. So this lets me type in 3 other numbers there if I choose an integer and choose those as additionally valid answers, with a width, of course, applied. Let's move down again. So if I go to a character question, you can see I set the width here, and again you're allowed up to 256 characters there. So you might want to put in 100 characters as the valid width. And you can see with character that it automatically enables these features here. So I can either restore that data exactly as it's typed. So if someone were to enter yes with a capital Y, a lowercase e and a lowercase s, that's how it would be stored. If that box was checked, it would be stored as capital Y, capital E, capital S, and in lowercase it would be all in lowercase. So you can control how that data is stored when people type answers, or a data entry clerk types in an answer from a character question. Text for interview, when you click that button, you'll see down here that this box is enabled, the show picture. Now what the show picture does, it allows the interviewer to show a picture or a video. So if I click on this box here, you'll see I get put into the browser, and it will allow me to choose a BMP file, a WMV file, or an AVI file, so that a video or a picture can be shown to a respondent as part of the interview. And of course that will only apply to CAPI surveys and things like that, where you have an interviewer present to conduct or administer the interview itself. We come to verbatim text. So this is a verbatim question where you're going to have answers to an open-ended, and the open-ended will end up in a separate CSV file. And we have date and time, which I said we're not going to cover in this interview. So let's now work around the rest of the form here. So the first thing we're going to type in for most questions will be the question text. So, do you own a Nissan car? So that's the first thing we're going to type in. And now we can put in some instructions. So these can be instructions for the interviewer or for somebody doing data entry. And so you could put in an instruction to make it clear what someone's got to do. And you could use a color coding system here. So you could say that anything that's highlighted in yellow would be an instruction to somebody doing data entry so that they know what they've got to do when it comes to data entry. So let's work around more things on this form now. Now you can see here the data location has been disabled, and that's because there's two ways of working in QPSMR. You can have a project where you don't want to set any data location so that QPSMR allocates them for itself, and that would be true probably of any new project that you're running. But there might be occasions where you do want to decide where data is stored in terms of data location, and that would be perhaps where a client has specified they want particular answers in particular fields, or perhaps you're trying to match some survey data to some back data that may or may have not been collected in QPSMR previously. Now, if you want to start having that field opened up so that you can specify your own locations, you will need to go into the global project settings and click this box here to say locations fix switch so that you're able to specify the locations. And then once that's checked, that box that I was showing you just now will be enabled so that you can type in here the exact location you want the data for that particular question to be stored. So let's move on down here. So we move on now to old style locations or not. Now what old style locations do is store the data in different ways. So what old style locations would mean is that QPS will store the data in codes on a field, and by default it will use codes 1 through to 9 and 0, so in other words 10 locations. You can edit that in your global project settings to include two other codes that are occasionally used in market research called X and V, but I'd recommend actually just leaving it with the default 1 to 9 and 0, so you've got 10 codes. Or you can turn that off so that it actually stores it as a numeric value. Now, if you've only got 9 codes, that will make absolutely no difference because it will store it as 1 to 9 in either case. If you've got 10 or more codes, let's say you've got 12, with old style locations, it will store that as 1 to 9 and 0 on the first field and then put 1 and 2 onto the subsequent field. If we turn that checkbox off, it will just store it as a numeric field of 2 digits in width. So if somebody answered 11, it will be stored as 1, 1. Rather than if it was 11 with old style locations, it would be blank on the first field and 1 on the subsequent field. So that's what old style locations are. Now, one difference that you'll notice between single and multiple response questions is this max allowed box here. Now, if I turn off old style locations here, it will have an effect in that it will change the width and the maximum allowed. Now, what this means, let's explain this more fully. So old style location, when that was switched on, means that it's going to use codes 1 to 9 and 0 on as many fields as it needs to allocate for the responses you have. So if you had 100 responses, it would take 10 fields with 10 responses in each one, assuming you left it as the default 1 to 9 and 0. Now, if we turn this off and use new style locations, what it will do with the multis is that it will allow you to store them as what's called spread fields. So we could say that we want a width of 2 and will allow up to a maximum of 6 answers. So if a respondent gives the answers 1, 3, 5 and 7, it would be stored 0, 1, 0, 3 and 0, 7, so 0, 5, 0, 7 in those 4 consecutive blocks of 2-digit characters in width. So that's the way that it works there if you allow if you turn off the old style locations with a multiple response question. All right, so let's look at some of the other things we've got in here now. We've got some things here which I think are fairly rarely used, but just to explain what they are. These options over here on the right with no routing, question routing and text routing have no actual effect on the routing through the questionnaire. Filters are the way that you route through your questionnaire. These will be just text that will appear when you print your questionnaire as a paper questionnaire. So they're pretty much redundant for CAPI and CATI interviews, but if you're doing a paper questionnaire and you want a copy of the questionnaire on paper, you may want to put some instructions as to which question they go to next. So if answering question 1 you want to go to question 2, you could put in some text here that says that you want to go to question 2, and in here you type that text, or you could put some text in there saying go to question 2, for example, but it has no physical effect on the order of how things are collected at data entry or anything like that, so it really is quite limited in what it will do for you. Location, these set of boxes here, location as in list, location beginning, location end. If you're adding things to your questionnaire, by default you typically add them to the end of your survey. So when you're preparing a questionnaire, you would typically just add questions. After question 1 you do question 2, after question 2 you do question 3, and so on. If you wanted to put it somewhere else because you missed one out, for example, you would put it in a particular place in the list. You might say, I want to put this after question 3 because you missed a question out, and you'll find under the project menu that if you, for example, one trick that you can do, say you put in questions 1, 2 and 3 and realise you missed a question out within question 2 and 3, you could have put a question in after question 2 as question 999, renumber the questions, and then they become question 1, 2, 3, 4 for you, with question 1 staying the same, 2 the same, but 3 moving down to 4, and the question 999 going into question 3. So that's how you do that. Over here you've got some additional texts. So these some additional text that you can add before the question, some additional text that you can put after the question, either perhaps describing what someone's got to do, or more instructions the interviewer has to read out, or instructions for completing it, perhaps some instructions on how to complete a particular question. And here you've got some instructions for the person doing data entry as well. So these are just additional bits of text for instructions. The print settings really only apply if you're going to print the questionnaire using the project print questionnaire features, where you create a questionnaire as a file and then print it. I think they're fairly rarely used these days and probably are not really relevant for CAPI or CATI unless you just want to control exactly how it looks like. But typically there you'd stay with the standard settings, which sets a fixed width of 78, a length of page of 62 lines, and so on. So you can change those if you want to change your look of your questionnaire. And you can have 2 columns of questions on a page if you want to, if you're interested in printing out your questionnaire. Now we're not going to cover some of the buttons here. The filters buttons are all covered in separate videos, so we're not going to look at that here. That is going to be ignored. And the responses we're not going to cover here. That's been covered in the up and running series of videos, and there'll be another video that will go into the detailed aspects of the responses worksheet, rather like this video that's covered the detailed aspects of the question worksheet. So that leaves us down here at the bottom with some things at the bottom of the the worksheet here. Suspend input is rather like hiding a questionnaire, so if we check that box, the question just won't appear when data's being collected. So it's a way of hiding a question. Maybe a question's disappeared off your questionnaire temporarily for some reason, or a particular month of a survey. So that would suspend input. Blank empty allowed. Now that does confuse people sometimes and is worth explaining. It has no effect when you're doing data entry from a paper questionnaire, but for a CAPI or a CATI survey, you can't just skip past the question unless blank is allowed. So for a paper questionnaire, where anybody could have anything on a piece of paper, it is blank, and that's what's got to be dealt with or handled. But if you don't check this on a CAPI or CATI questionnaire, you won't be allowed past this question. Randomize responses means that you want to randomize the responses. We looked at the show picture thing just now, where you could show a picture or show a video under interviewer text. Pre-select responses is a way of pulling responses through from a previous question. So an example of that might be that you have asked people which brands they ever buy, and then at the next question you want to ask them which ones they regularly buy, and you might want to pre-select all the ever buy, because if it's a long list you might want to just uncheck the ones that they don't want. Or conversely, if the question's around the other way, perhaps more appropriate, you could ask people which brands they regularly buy and then ever buy at the next question. And certainly when it comes to the ever buy question, you would want all of the answers given at the regularly buy, because you would want to make them pre-selected to save the person doing the data entry or the interviewer having to check all those off again. Auto-select responses is where you want to have the data stored, but you don't actually want to collect it. Now that sounds a little bit strange, but for example, sometimes you may have a question: which brand do you buy most often, which brand do you buy second most often, third most often, and what other brands do you buy? So 4 questions there. The first one would be single, because the most often would be a single response. The second most often would be single. The third most often would be single. And the fourth question, which said any other brands they bought, would be multiple, because they could obviously choose any number of the other ones. And so what we can do there is that we could construct a variable that picks up answers from any of those questions, from the 4 questions, and store that in the data. And that would use, you'd then select the auto select responses option. And when you select either of these options, you'll see down here, this box here becomes enabled, so that you can just type in the question that you want, or the variable where you want that you want to store this in. So that's for pre-select and auto select responses. So that's taken us all the way around the question worksheet. So let's now slip over to the QPSMR companion, and you'll find it's pretty much the same here as we saw before. It looks a bit different, it's laid out differently, but width and maximum responses are the same. The rules on the name are exactly the same. The options you have here are pretty much the same as we had before. You've got color coding here like we had before to color code the instructions. And then you'll find in different tabs some of the extra things that were perhaps in slightly different places on the question worksheet. So extra here, we've got text before or after on a paper questionnaire. Filters is something slightly different, which are covered in separate videos, but all the settings that we talked about are pretty much here again. So where you put the selections at the beginning, as in the list and end, CATI, whether it's a sample point, showing a picture or a video, suspending input, and so on. So all these things pretty much match up with what we saw just now, upper and lower case. So everything is pretty much as it was before. And then you've got the responses here, which, as I said, we're going to cover in a separate video, which shows you how to use the features in the responses worksheet. So that completes this video. I hope it was useful to you, and you probably want to follow on and watch the video on responses that follows. Thank you.